Welcome back to Divine Whispers. So, step 1 is at least entertaining the possibility that these things can happen. Step 2 is simply starting where you are at, and this is different for each of us. Do you need mud on your eyes, or can you move forward with thought? Either is fine and either works as long as you start at the level of your belief. Many of you might be familiar with the story of Moses leading his people through the wilderness for 40 years. God spoke to Moses and instructed him to speak to a stone, and water for his people would spring forth from the stone. But instead, Moses struck the stone with his stick rather than speaking to the stone. And though water did indeed flow forth, we are taught that Moses disobeyed God and was therefore not allowed into the promised land, which, if it were true, would be a little harsh even for the wrathful God of the Old Testament. So there's your clue to watch for the metaphor. And the metaphor was that Moses was to move beyond his normal props and physical tactics and gestures, and instead into the thought, the will, the verbal commandment, into the word rather than the gesture. So it wasn't a punishment that he wasn't allowed into the promised land. It was simply an indication of the eventual limitations that our reliance upon physical props and gestures always come with. They can only take you so far. So eventually, we all must move beyond the sleight of hand gestures that we pull on ourselves. To stay with them, though they work to a certain degree, will keep you from greater things. It'll keep you from the promised land. But if this is where you're currently at, then this is where you must start. And ambitiously trying to move beyond it before you're ready, and you'll find you just spin your wheels, and you may fall into disillusionment. And worst of all, your failed efforts will begin to build the opposite belief. It will begin to build the belief that this isn't possible, and that's not what you want. So, be realistic with yourself, because it's in your best interest and it's the speediest route to what you are seeking. But know that eventually we move beyond physical props. In our present state of awareness, many of us do well with mud. In fact, using mud, or props and triggers, is not only the basis of what evolved to eventually be called magic, it's also the basis of a latter development that we call the medical profession. Certain potions, whether they contain eye of newt or some highly refined chemical compound, are basically mud on our eyes. We accept the mud and follow the directions to wash it off in certain water, just like we take our medicine and continue to act upon our belief that it will be effective by taking it in a prescribed manner. It's truly the same thing. Again, I'm not telling you to discontinue your medicines. If that is what you have currently given your belief to, then at the moment, that is where your needs are being met as best as they are able. But I do hope that you can begin to see how all of these things are closely linked, and in fact are different expressions of the very same thing. They are all a belief linked to a tangible trigger or a prop, whether that be a chemical compound in the form of a pill, or mud on your eyes, or a chicken bone amulet to ward off evil. What works most effectively for you will depend upon what you truly believe in. Now wait a minute, you say. I can give someone a pill to make them go to sleep, and they're going to go to sleep, whether or not they know about the pill, much less believe in it. Well, sometimes. And I can use myself as a reference for this because I personally do not respond in conventional ways to a lot of things. So I know from direct experience that that isn't always true. But in most cases, it does happen that way. And if so, and if what I'm pointing to is true, why would this happen? Why would they fall asleep without consciously knowing about, much less believing in that pill? The short answer is this. There are patterns and default programs that are created and used in a certain manner and are believed in such a universal way by the collective subconscious that their patterns tend to hold with little variation, whether or not the individual is consciously aware of it or any of its supposed properties, because we are all one. Now, I am an example of someone whose awareness is changing, and because of that, things don't always follow their commonly expected default patterns for me. There's a crack in my system, you might say, from my broadened perspective. And as Leonard Cohen, the writer and musician, says in his song Anthem, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. For now, just realize that default programs that have little variation in their usage display somewhat universal and established repeating patterns, because no one or few are seeing them in a different way. And, just FYI, sometimes these repeat patterns differ predictably between different groups. What may hold true as a repeat pattern for one group may hold a completely different repeat pattern with another group, because groups are somewhat like collective individuals, and their reactions may differ depending upon their perspective, in the same way that I sometimes react differently to fairly repetitive patterns. I know this can all get a bit confusing, but while I'm at it, I might as well take a moment to briefly discuss this topic of our association with groups, something that I have mentioned before in several of my videos. So please join me in part 3 of Divine Whispers.